Chapter 24. What about a night attack? Will asked. Could we get away with fewer men that way? Horace shook his head. We still need the numbers to keep the defenders guessing. Night or day, it doesn't make a difference. We need more men than they do. They had been discussing the problem since the meeting in Malcolm's cottage had broken up early that morning. But so far, there was no sign of a solution. The two friends had decided to ride back through the forest to a point where they could study the castle to see if there were any weak points in its defence. They left their horses a few metres back from the forest edge and proceeded on foot to where they could see Castle Macindaw. As Will had done when he had attempted to rescue Alice, they had approached from the eastern side, moving along the road where it passed through a slight depression deep enough to conceal them from the castle ramparts. As the road angled up and reached a crest, they sank to their knees. The grim castle stood a little under 200 metres away. Will was reminded of a crouching, waiting monster. He picked sourly at a clump of dried, frozen grass thrusting up through the snow. Do you have to be so negative? He said. Sometimes it helps if you keep your thinking flexible. Horace turned slowly towards him. It was a deliberate movement that was familiar to Will. I'm not negative and I'm not inflexible, Horace said. I'm just facing facts. Well, let's face some others, Will suggested. You can't ignore facts just because you don't like them, Will, Horace said, his irritation showing in his tone of voice. The fact is, siege work is a very precise, very ordered science, and there are rules and guidelines that have been laid down after years of trial and error and experience. If we're going to besiege a castle, we'll need more men than the defenders, not less. That's a fact, whether you like it or not. I know, Will replied, irritated in his turn. It's just I feel there must be more to it than merely saying, we need 3 times as many men as the defenders. 4 times, Horace put in. Will gestured in annoyance. 4 times then, and then we will win the battle. It leaves any innovative ideas or stratagems out of the equation and reduces it to numbers. What about ingenuity and imagination? They're part of a battle plan too, you know. Horace shrugged. Your area, not mine. And that was the problem, Will knew. People looked to rangers for innovation and ingenuity when it came to planning a battle. But he had been wrestling with this problem since Horace had arrived from the south, and he was no closer to a solution. Some ranger he'd turned out to be, he thought bitterly. Perhaps the most infuriating part of it all was that he had a feeling that there was an idea floating around in his subconscious, hovering just out of reach. It had been triggered by something that he had seen or heard in the past few days, but for the life of him, he couldn't put a finger on it. It only made him feel more inadequate. Well, we know one thing, Horace said. If we do attack them, it won't be from this side. Will nodded. There was too much open ground to cross. Once their force broke cover from the forest edge, they would be in full view of the castle. An attack from this side would have no element of surprise about it, he thought. By the time the attackers reached the walls, they could well have lost 1/3 of their number to the defenders' crossbows. Horace, as if reading his mind, took the opportunity to reinforce the point he had been making earlier. Another reason why we need to outnumber them, he said. We could lose a lot of men attacking across open ground like this. Will nodded gloomily. All right, he said. Point made. He looked up at Alice's tower window. half closing his eyes in the effort to focus. The heavy tapestry that was used to keep out the wind had been drawn back, and the window formed a black rectangle in the grey stone of the wall. Then he thought he saw a flash of white, as if someone had just passed close to the window. It could only have been Alice. "Did you see that?" he asked. Horace, who had been studying the drawbridge and gatehouse, glanced at him curiously. "See what?" "I thought I saw something at Alice's window," Will told him. "Just a flash of white, as if she'd passed by it," he added sadly. Horace stared at the high window, but there was no further sign of movement. The window was a dark hole in the wall again. He shrugged. "It was probably her," he said. He understood his friend's disappointment. It was galling to know that Alice was barely 200 meters away from them, and they were powerless to help her in any way. It must be worse for the ranger, Horace realized, knowing that he had left her behind to face the danger alone. "Pity I can't signal her," Will said, "just to let her know we're here. It'd raise her spirits a little." "Problem is, you'd let Keren know as well. And it's not a good idea to alert him to the fact we're surveying his castle. It's always better to keep the enemy guessing." "I know," Will said disconsolately. "I'll send her a message tonight, just to let her know we haven't forgotten her." Will decided it was time to distract his friend from these gloomy thoughts. He glanced around to the south, where more open country lay before the castle. "Doesn't look any better that way," he said. "Any ideas?" Remaining crouched, they squirmed backwards until they were below the crest once more, then stood, dusting the damp snow from their knees and elbows. Will pointed to the west. "The west side may be our best bet," he said. "The forest grows a lot closer on that side." "Let's take a look then," Horace said. They made their way back to the tethered horses, mounted, and rode north. They stayed inside the tree line, where the shadows would hide them from any watchers on the castle walls. Horace felt his spirits sinking as they rode. The castle seemed impregnable. Even with a larger force, it would be a tough nut to crack. With under 30 men, he could see no way they could accomplish it. Yet he didn't voice the thought because he knew how Will would react. In addition, he sensed the underlying frustration that Will was feeling. Horace had faith in Will's ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable problems. Will was a ranger after all, and he had been trained by Holt, recognized as the greatest of all rangers. And Horace knew that rangers had ideas, blindingly brilliant ideas that seemed to come out of nowhere. He had seen Will do it before, and he sensed, without really knowing how, that there was an idea building now, simply waiting for his friend to recognize it and develop it. If that were the case, it would not help matters if Horace were to tell him that he thought there was no chance of success. Quite simply, they had to succeed, for Alice's sake and for the sake of the kingdom. When Caleb McFruin led his 200 men through the trees in 3 weeks' time, he was going to have to find Castle Macindaw in the hands of a garrison who were determined to bar his way. Then the Scotti would face similar problems to the one confronting Horace and Will. They would have the numbers of men necessary for a siege, but they wouldn't have the supplies for a prolonged attack, nor the specialized siege machines and weapons. They didn't expect to have to take Macindaw. They assumed it would be in friendly hands when they arrived, leaving them free to range out into the Araluen lowlands and raid and pillage, without the threat of a hostile castle at their backs. Earlier that morning, Xander had left Grimsdale, accompanied by one of Mallkallam's people. They would travel across country on foot, planning to bypass Keren's roadblocks. Once clear, they hoped to buy, or if necessary steal, horses from one of the farms in the area. Xander was carrying a written account of the situation at Macindaw and the Scotti plans for an invasion to Castle Norgate. The report was sent over Ormond's signature and sealed with the signet ring of the Lord of Castle Macindaw. So in addition to Macindaw lying across their supply lines and denying the Scotti a strong point, they would hopefully be faced with the prospect of a relieving force moving on them from the northwest. Speed was essential to the Scotti plans, and any delay in their scheme could be fatal for them. Which brought Horace back to their present predicament, finding a way to take Macindaw with less than 30 men. Once in possession of the castle, they had no doubt they could augment their current numbers by rehiring the members of the garrison Keren had forced out. They mightn't be willing to sign up for an attack on the castle, but once it was back in Ormond's hands, word would go round the countryside, and Horace was confident most of the old garrison would return. After all, they were soldiers, and there was precious little else for them to do in the dead of winter. But it all had to be done within the next 3 weeks. "This is the spot," Will said, interrupting his thoughts. They had ridden north towards the point where they had ambushed McHaddish and his men, then turned west through the trees. Now, as they reached the western fringe of the forest, the going became more difficult. At this part of the forest, the trees grew together in a tangle that was almost impenetrable, so that they were forced to move out into the open ground. On the western side, Horace saw, the forest reached up to within 50 metres of the castle. He could understand why the original builders had left it this way. Clearing the forest would have been a monumentally difficult task, and the very nature of the forest itself made it impassable for a large number of men laden with equipment, weapons, and siege machinery. Horace rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Well, for once, our small numbers will be an advantage," he said, gesturing towards the thick undergrowth and close-growing trees. "I'd hate to try to move more than 30 men into position through all that." Will nodded. "All we have to do is figure out a way to make Keren think we have another 100 men attacking from the east," he said. Horace shrugged. "Or the south. Anything to get them off the west ramparts." "Let me ask you something," Will said. The thoughtful tone in his voice made Horace look around at him quickly. Will's frustration and short temper seemed to have left him. Maybe the idea was coming after all, Horace thought. "Go on," he prompted, and Will continued, choosing his words carefully. "If we could distract them from this wall, could we manage with just one scaling ladder?" "Just one?" Horace looked doubtful. "It's usually better to have as many as you can. That way you split the defenders' numbers." "But if they're drawn to the south wall, say, and they don't see us coming until we're over the wall, then 2 of us could hold them off while the rest of our men come up the ladder, couldn't we?" "2 of us?" Horace asked. "I assume you mean you and me." Will nodded. "The walkways on the ramparts are narrow," he said. "They could only come at us one at a time. I seem to recall you and I did a pretty good job of holding off the Temujai at Hallersholm," he reminded Horace. "True, but it all depends on our getting up and over the wall unseen. Even if we could distract most of the defenders with an attack on the south wall, they won't all go. Nobody's that stupid. And we'd have 50 meters to run, carrying a 5-meter scaling ladder. We'd be spotted before we got a third of the way. Will smiled. Not if we're already there. Horace frowned at him. Already there? What are you getting at? He asked. But Will made a negative gesture with his hand. Just an idea, he said. I want to check something with Mallkallam before I say any more. But I think I might have worked out how we can manage this. Horace could see he was not going to say any more for the moment. But he wasn't going to let Will have the last word. He smiled inwardly as he assumed a long-suffering look. Well, it took you long enough, he said.